Welcome to the Pivot Clean Energy Podcast, How the World Cooks, the energy shift you need to know about. I'm your host, Alicia Elmamuni. On this podcast, we are going to explore everything cooking, how it impacts the world, and why you should care. Let's go. Johan Ullman started his career at Procter Gamble in Geneva, eventually taking on the role of global strategy owner for ethanol sourcing. He then transitioned to the trading side of the market, spending close to a decade in the ethanol trading divisions of Cargill and Bunge. His entrepreneurial spirit led him to play a pivotal role in the establishment of Marquis Energy Global in Singapore, where he presently holds the position of managing director and lives with his wife and 4 children. In this episode, we tackle the enormous continent of Asia and provide a high-level overview of what bioethanol use, demand, and future potential looks like for the industry there. Johan will share the importance of understanding global markets and why it was important for Marquis as an American company to have a location based in Asia. He'll touch on the variety across Asia and what feedstocks are used in different regions, as well as how the use of co-products is different than what we might see in North America. We will look at some success stories, including the Philippines, and how they have been able to leverage bioethanol for the transportation industry and how policies have assisted in creating demand across the continent. And of course, we will hear about the potential for bioethanol clean cooking and how it could fit into both a rural and urban space in Asia as clean fuels become more widely available. Welcome to How the World Cooks today, Johan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alicia. Happy to be here.
We're currently doing a series on bioethanol and how it varies in different parts of the world. And so far, we've gone to South America and Europe. And now we are going to have you join us to talk about Asia. And so we're looking forward to hearing your expertise on what that market looks like compared to some of the areas that we've already traveled to. So let's get started.
Excellent.
You are the managing director of Marquis Energy Global, and you're based out of Singapore. Can you tell us a little bit about Marquis and the space that the company operates in?
Sure. So Marquis is in fact a U.S. ethanol producer. We have 2 facilities. One of them is outside of Chicago, about 2.5 hours southwest. It's actually currently the world's largest dry mill ethanol plant, producing about almost 400 million gallons. And then there's another facility we have in Necedah, Wisconsin, which is slightly smaller, but also producing about just over 100 million gallons. So between the two, we produce 500 million gallons, and we are primarily focused on the U.S. market, but also a lot of our product at the Illinois facility is exported because we have extremely good yields around our farms. That gives us a really sustainable product, which of course meets all the requirements that we have in Europe, as well as gives us a staging ground to export products. So Marquis Energy Global, where I'm the managing director, was set up about 6 years ago here in Singapore to help market, distribute, and trade the ethanol, as well as the DDGs, which is produced with the ethanol from the corn to the international market. So we're essentially the distribution marketing arm of Marquis Energy in the US. But we also do trade third-party gallons. So we also buy in product that can be used for markets that need the product.
Great. And you mentioned DDGs. Can you just elaborate on what that is quickly for those who might not know?
Sure. So essentially, when you produce ethanol from corn, you essentially use 3 tons of corn, and you get 1 ton of ethanol, 1 ton of dried distiller grain solubles, which is also called DDGs, and 1 ton of CO2. So the ethanol, of course, can be used in a plethora of different applications, and DDGs is primarily used for animal feed. So it's a protein. It's typically got a pro-fat content somewhere between 30 to 40%, and it's used in cattle, livestock, swine production. So those are typically exported to different markets, and So at our plant, we produce about 1 million tons of DDGs that we export.
Okay, wow. So Marquis is a US-based company, but you certainly have a global presence, and especially in Europe and where you are located in Asia for a marketing and distribution purpose.
Correct. Yes.
Great. So can you describe your role in the company, what brought you to work full-time in Singapore, and kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So essentially, I mean, my career, I started in the ethanol space almost 20 years ago. I was in
Okay.
fact buying ethanol for consumer goods. So my first gig was as a procurement manager at Procter and Gamble.
Oh,
So within that space, I actually started buying fish meal, which was going into Iams and Eukanuba, as well as seasonings for Pringles, which is
okay.
that's a
Are
story
these
for
trade
that's
secrets you're sharing here?
yeah, signed an NDA. Yeah, that's a story for another time. So within P&G, of course, you have a range of different products, and a lot of them, of course, fabric and home care, the Tide that you would use, or your Dawn dish soap. All those contain small amounts of ethanol.
Hmm.
So I essentially became the global strategy owner of ethanol procurement at Procter and Gamble, and I really became fascinated with the product. At that time, it was the RFS. So this is late 2000s, mid 2000s. We certainly started to see the growth of U.S. ethanol, specifically on the
Hmm.
fuel market linked to RFS.
Hmm.
Previous to that, it's what I would call the traditional market. It was mostly used for applications in beverage and chemical production.
Okay.
But there you can see this boom going on, and really got fascinated with the feedstock side of things, the commodity aspect to it, and I made the jump to the trading side, joining Cargill in Geneva.
Okay.
So that's where I really cut my teeth on the trading floor, understanding more of the underlying trading aspects of the feedstocks such as sugar,
Hmm.
corn, wheat, the different feedstocks that are used to produce ethanol. And there was a role that came up. I had been in Europe for quite some time, and I decided that we wanted to try something a bit new. So there was a role opening up with another company called Bunge to be out in Singapore. So I moved over here
Oh,
and with my family, and we absolutely loved it. So there were some changes, and essentially I had to make a decision whether I wanted to go back to Europe or stay here. And I think my family and I decided that this was where we wanted to be. And so I helped establish Marquis Energy Global after discussions with the Marquis family over here, and set this up to be basically the arm and ears of eyes and ears and arms of Marquis in terms of understanding the global market and getting product moved.
hmm.
So currently, we are
Wow.
one of the top three shippers out of the U.S. market in terms of ethanol. One of the largest DDG bulk shippers out of the U.S. Gulf, and yeah, so we're just continuing to grow the business abroad.
Wow. So you played a really big role in initiating their presence in Asia then.
Yeah, I mean, there was of course a real interest from the family to have that. I think that's a realization that the global markets are important,
Sure.
especially with the location with our facility being on the Illinois River that
Hmm.
connects, of course, to the Mississippi around St. Louis, and that export piece has always been critical to understand for their business, right? So they've always
Yeah.
been exporting, but I mean, the fact is that a lot of their product, if you were to not have that export angle, you'd have a lot of that product in one of the main pricing hubs in the US, right? So you'd be right outside Chicago, which would then, of
Hmm.
course, put a lot of pressure on the prices. So we always try and, everything being equal, looking to export gallons to make sure that we can access those export markets.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're now in Asia full time. You got your interest in bioethanol and you moved across a few different companies and you landed in Singapore working for Marquis. And so now you're more familiar with that world. And so that's what we want to focus on today. And bioethanol is produced around the world, but has multiple feedstocks and end uses. And so I'm interested in what the primary feedstocks are that are used in Asia to produce bioethanol.
So Asia's huge, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're basically going from Istanbul all the way to Tokyo. So you span a lot of countries, a lot of different agricultural land, populations, cultures. Um, Overall, I mean, the main feedstocks are going to be quite familiar. It will be corn and sugarcane or molasses. Those are the main ones. So, for example, in China, the main feedstock for production there is corn. And if you pivot then to, for example, Thailand is going to be molasses out of the sugarcane production.
Hmm.
Pakistan uses molasses as well from their sugar production. So there's other more maybe unique feedstocks in the region. You use cassava as well in parts of
Sure.
Vietnam. Um, but beside those three, I would say the bulk of the production will be corn, cane, and cassava.
Okay. In that order, corn, cane, and cassava.
You need to fact check me, but I mean,
Okay.
I think China. I mean, they're a huge producer, right? So they produce almost, yeah, 4 million tons, and that's all coming out of corn. But then you have Thailand, Pakistan that uses molasses. I would say it's. I'll need to run the numbers, but I think it's pretty neck and neck between those two
Hmm.
feedstocks, and cassava a small amount after that.
And do you see them also utilizing co-products when they're using either corn or sugar as their primary feedstock? Are they also doing energy cogeneration or high protein animal feed or CO2? Do you also see them utilizing that?
Generally not. I mean, with the uh, on corn, of course, you have the DDGs, right? It's the same process.
Sure.
It's the same grind the corn, ferment it, and then you distill the ethanol. Um, on the most of the production is primarily based on cane. Then you get the molasses, and then from there you produce it. So you do not have that cogeneration really. But in the cassava, neither. So I think overall, it's a slightly different procedure or process over here.
Okay. But is there potential for them to do that? Do you think there would be interest on the
Yeah, for sure,
continent to do
for
that?
sure. There's always that. It's also all about the scalability and investment needed, right? So
Sure.
it's slightly yeah. Most companies here are not as I guess well financed or as sophisticated as companies in probably the U.S. or in Brazil.
Sure. And so you mentioned, Marquis is exporting bioethanol and DDGs and CO2. Are those all being distributed through Asia as well, or is it only one of those products?
So I would say we most of our flows because we do have very high greenhouse gas savings, and we're approved under Renewable Energy Directive in Europe. The bulk of our production does go into Europe for ethanol, so
Okay.
that's our main flow. But there are always opportunities to ship into Asia, and we do
Hmm.
have storage positions, for example, in Vietnam and in
Okay.
Korea, which help
Okay.
facilitate exports. So on the ethanol side, yes, we do export some of our own products. Sometimes we would buy in ethanol from third parties and ship. But on the DDG side, there's also opportunities because there's a protein deficit in the region. So there's a
Hmm.
lot of for a lot of these animal feed producers and buyers, they would then be looking at DDGs as a really um, good component for their feed mix. So we do export DDGs into the region. So, for example,
Okay.
Thailand and Vietnam, and a lot of US DDGs goes to Indonesia and Philippines. Those are
Hmm.
more in container sizes. We typically ship bulk into the region. So I would
Okay.
say probably if you would say how much of our turnover would be split between Europe and Asia, I'd probably put yeah, 70-30 or something like that.
Okay. And in terms of the bioethanol that Asia is currently producing today, do you know what those volumes look like across the region? And what's it primarily being used for?
Yeah, so actually, Asia is an interesting one in the sense that most regions uses ethanol as a fuel component, right? So they're
Okay.
typically using it for the octane or for the GHGs. So ethanol is a great clean burning fuel. It's high octane. It has no particulate matter in that sense
Mhm.
versus other fuels. But the region here uh, and you look at total demand, it's roughly 30 million cubes is total demand in the region, right? Roughly. That demand is split roughly 50-50 between, I would call traditional usages, so going into beverage,
Sure.
chemical production, other applications, and then fuel, 50%.
Okay.
But now we're seeing a big uptick on the fuel side as India rolls out their program. So India
Hmm.
is now becoming the largest user of fuel ethanol, and that's primarily a domestic program. And then you have China. So between India and China, that's probably about 80% of the fuel market in Asia.
Wow.
So there's as an octane in the US, for example, if you go back in time a bit, ethanol essentially replaced MTBE, right? So
Hmm.
MTBE, which is a fuel ether, is very a good octane, but in the US, um, it was basically found to contaminate groundwater, so that was banned. But in this region, MTBE has a strong foothold because it's a very good
Okay.
clean burning fuel. So if you go back in time a bit, you had a serious air quality issues across the
Hmm.
region. The quality was not, I mean, Euro 2 level is quite bad in terms of the sulfur contents. And MTB was introduced as an alternative to boost your octane,
Hmm.
and also it burns quite cleanly. So in terms of the mix here, a lot of company or countries' gasoline specifications actually favor MTB within that spec.
Hmm.
Now, ethanol, on the other hand, has it's got a lot to do with politics. As I mentioned, there are many different countries. There's many different interests in all of these countries. So typically, countries that have access to feedstocks has implemented biofuel policies. So
Okay.
take the Philippines for example. They have an E10 right now. So an E10 is a 10% blend of ethanol, and that's
Hmm.
primarily because you have a lot of sugar production in the region of Negros in the Philippines. So they essentially allow 10% blend to help support that rural economy, uh,
Okay.
and that region, but that region cannot meet the full E10
Sure.
requirements. So you in fact need to import probably the balance. So if you think about E10 in the Philippines is probably something around 400 to 500,000 cubes. Their domestic production can only reach probably 250,000 cubes. So
Hmm.
there's a gap between what their mandate says, and that's
Yeah.
typically a product that's imported. Similarly, you have in Vietnam, they have a mandate of E5 on their RON 92 gasoline.
Hmm.
So they allow 5% ethanol into that market, also because they have some cassava production in the country. So they want to help stimulate
Sure.
use of
Their
ethanol from
rural
that.
economy. Yeah.
Exactly. And then you look at Japan, which takes a slightly different approach. They are more bound by the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accords. They want to reduce their GHGs. They go a different route. They import actually ETBE to help with their octane and environmental requirements. And the ETB is essentially similar to MTB. ETB is made from ethanol as opposed to methanol. So you have a greenhouse gas pickup on the ETB, which you would
Hmm.
not have with the MTB. And then if you look at India and their big push, right, that's the huge story in the region in the sense that they've moved from essentially an E3 to an E10 last
Yeah.
year, an E12 coming up probably this year.
Very quickly. Hmm.
That's very quickly. That's all got to do with their domestic policy. Again, supporting energy independence and helping the rural economy. So they've had this huge push to get E10, and that's been helped by the government programs that they've been um, it's essentially helping to build that market out.
Hmm.
China is another one, right? So that's also to do with policy. They have E10 in only certain cities, but of course China with a big market, they produce it out of corn, and that's quite a big demand. But that's all domestic, right? They don't import
Hmm.
any ethanol into China right now.
Okay.
And then Thailand, I mean, Thailand's another one, right? So they use a lot of sugarcane or molasses as an outlet. You fill up your car there in Bangkok, you'd be at an E20.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting story, particularly where you're seeing Vietnam and the Philippines start to expand their policy around biofuels mandates, but unable to meet them. And so the Philippines have, been growing local content, but also importing to help supplement. And I think that's something that we're going to see in the global south as we start to see bioethanol expand into sub-Saharan Africa, that these countries that are really interested in it might not have the agricultural capacity immediately to be able to meet those mandates. And so looking at using imports to not only start market demand, but also help supplement in order to meet their mandates. And so it's nice to see that that's been successful in some countries in Asia.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the key message. I mean, right now it's everyone thinks, well, you're importing product, but in the end, economically, it's still much cheaper to bring in ethanol from the U.S. or from Brazil because
Mm.
the prices are the economies of scale are just difficult to
Yes, so
surmount,
much
especially as
larger.
you're building the market out. And if you think back to
Yep.
the U.S. ethanol industry, back to its roots, there was, of course, subsidies to help get the industry off the ground. So it's just about getting that kickstart from the government to
Hmm.
actually push it and
Yep.
get that moving forward. And you're right. If once you get that ball rolling, it becomes a very virtuous circle because then you can increase. You get more investment into
Hmm.
the farmland, into agriculture, and then you
Absolutely.
create demand around that. So there's huge potential on that, and I think we should, yeah, as a solution for both the energy transition.
Hmm.
It's key. It really is. I just wanted to also add one point around demand. What's interesting now, we're starting to see a divergence between agricultural prices and crude prices. So you look
Mm.
at the corn yields we've had in the U.S. I mean, the WASDE report a couple of weeks ago showed we're at 177 bushels an acre yield, which is a record in the U.S. And
Hmm. Huge.
the trend line is actually upwards. And look at this is a record crop, and I mean, weather wasn't that great last year, but we still
Hmm.
managed to pull off such a great crop. As we grow it, look at the corn ethanol or the corn industry in Brazil. There's safrinha crop and the ethanol industry that's growing there. And you
Hmm.
look at, I mean, the potential around the world to grow corn production is enormous, right? So we haven't even started to really apply. Actually, China has, for that matter, applying, different types of technology, seed technology that actually really increases yields,
Yeah.
makes crops resistant to drought, which is of course going to be a key challenge with the
Game
climate.
changer.
Yeah, the climate change we're seeing. And I think, yeah, you need to implement it, but you can really build resistant crops that can actually maintain and grow yields.
Hmm.
And if you look at just the corn production that's grown in the past 20 years, right? We've gone from 600 million tons of corn, and we're about 1.2 billion tons this year. It's like
Enormous.
we've doubled the amount of corn. We've doubled the amount of corn in the world, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
insane, and there's so much more potential because we
So
haven't
much
really
more land that's
land
available.
and also yields, right? If you just start
Exactly.
applying the right seed technology and the investments, I mean, you can push extremely for food. I mean, think about food security, right? You
Hmm.
create a protein. It's clean for the environment. You can have our ethanol. We think once we start to sequester carbon, which is the CO2,
Yeah.
we can actually bring our carbon intensity close to net zero on a scope 1, 2, 3. So there's
Hmm.
no real solution. There's no real ready-made solution that's better at the moment, in my opinion, than ethanol.
Hmm. Yeah, and agriculture is such an important part of the story, particularly in areas that are food insecure. And when you do look at those examples of how the US has really grown, Brazil, other parts of the world, I'm sure some in Asia, where you see those rural economies really start to benefit from expanded agriculture that's going into multiple commodity markets. And so that's really important when we look at areas like sub-Saharan Africa and how they can begin to utilize the new technology and the resources that are available now and put them into something like bioethanol.
Exactly. That's huge potential.
Yeah, so obviously the volume that you currently have is not going to be sufficient for the demand that exists in Asia. What has that growth trajectory looked like in your years in Singapore? How much has the industry grown?
Well, I think overall we're really trying to push the envelope in terms of allowing more ethanol into the gasoline space. So when I
Hmm.
first arrived, ethanol was not really looked at besides a discretionary octane. What I mean by that is when you look at the the petroleum alternative, which would be typically MTBE, and you look at the price that is into your gasoline versus ethanol into the gasoline, you then because gasoline is essentially like a soup, right? So you have different ingredients to make your soup, and ethanol is one of those ingredients. And when your ingredient is cheaper than the other alternative, then you can use that in and blend it in. Of course, we've been through in the past, since I've been here 6 years, you've been through a trade war, you've had COVID, you've got all
Sure.
types of things going on. The volatility has been enormous. So you've got windows where you suddenly have this discretionary demand by blenders who want to buy ethanol to blend it into their gasoline.
Hmm.
So that's been on and off. So China was a big buyer. Then the trade war happened. Tariffs were put on U.S. ethanol, so that closed. But then you have suddenly Indonesia allowing 3.5% of ethanol within their imported gasoline. So that opened up, right? Then you
Hmm.
got E5 in Vietnam that opened up. And then we have increasing demand in as just gasoline demand in the region increases. But the big game changer for the region has been, of course, India, which has really
Yeah.
pushed what I thought was even possible. Like I was quite skeptical, not thinking that they managed because it's a huge endeavor, but they've managed to pull it off and show that it's possible. And
Yeah.
also, if you think about China, China was supposed to be E10 countrywide, but they scrapped that program. So it was supposed to be just
Hmm.
um, for the some cities. No, it was supposed to be countrywide, which had been like 10 million tons of ethanol demand, which is
Wow.
enormous. But now they decided not to deploy that fully across all their car fleet. And I think to your question around demand, I mean, we are seeing a lot of EV increases in China, right? So
Sure.
that's the EV. I think almost 30 or 40% of new car sales in China are EVs.
Oh, wow.
Now, but the funny thing is that gasoline cars are still increasing because the
Okay.
economy is just growing, right? So even though it's a growing share, the absolute numbers of cars, gasoline cars put on the road is still increasing.
Hmm.
Even though EVs are a larger share of that, you still have gasoline,
It's not
ice,
going away
I,
anytime
yeah,
soon.
no, ice vehicles. No, I don't think it's going to go away in the next 10, especially in this region, which is, I mean, I said in Southeast Asia where you have thousands of islands here. It would be extremely
Yeah.
difficult to deploy EV charging stations in like
Sure.
Indonesia or Philippines, where there's a lot of rural networks, which it's challenging. Maybe in the cities it makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
For example, like Jakarta or Manila or Ho Chi Minh. But I mean, for the rural areas, it's extremely difficult
Pretty
to deploy
difficult.
that strategy.
Yeah. And you've mentioned some of these countries that have been really big proponents of expanding bioethanol, like India, the Philippines. Do they have specific incentives outside of these mandates in place or specific policies that they're implementing, or is it pretty much just the mandates that they're trying to meet?
There are incentives, right? So essentially, the feedstocks are in a way subsidized. So you have minimum prices, which are way above what you would get in the market. So it incentivizes producers of the feedstocks to produce ethanol, right? So
Hmm.
essentially, you have a higher price for the in for example in India, you have a fixed price for the cane juice, the B or C heavy molasses. So those prices are
Okay.
fixed, right? Which is above the market price. So that then of course you then but you then you have to buy it, and then you have extremely good financing for new facilities to come up. So you have and then you have a requirement for the um, the oil companies to buy. So it's kind of a
Oh,
full
okay.
full chain of incentives that really help this market explode.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And do you think most of those countries are putting these clean fuels policies in place because they want to meet, Paris agreements or certain climate goals that they have internally, or what is the driver for setting those policies in place?
that is a tricky question.
Okay.
Um, of course, there are many ways to meet emissions targets, right? Road transport is
Sure.
a big one. Um, Now, it kind of depends on the country, right? So if a country has the natural resources and it kind of plays into the political landscape of that country, they would probably implement it. So take
Mm,
Philippines, for example. They have the feedstock and they could claim they have emission reductions is, of course, what they say. But I mean, in the end, a lot of politicians want to be reelected, so they try to put in policies that help generally a large part of the populace. So
sure.
I think in countries which are resource I mean, resource poor or don't have the feedstock, you probably won't see implementation of any mandates,
Mm-hmm.
right? The only countries that do that would be Japan. Like Japan is clearly paying a lot more for their ETB than they would if they would blend in MTBE, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are countries, for example, like Korea, which has no blending mandate, but they also signed up to all the protocols, but they're going to go another route. But that's all because
Sure.
the refining industry there is so strong. So they of course have a vested interest to keep, they don't want to cannibalize their market share on their
Right.
products. So they're not going to allow ethanol to come in and kind of get into
Mm-hmm.
their gasoline mix. So it's a mix of politics, economics, and a lot of these interest groups that are making the decisions. So it's very varied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, overall, though, it looks like bioethanol has a pretty big space in Asia.
Yes.
And what are some of the challenges, in your opinion, that could prohibit it from growing as quickly as it might otherwise?
I mean, I think for me, it's all about you know the economics. Primarily, that's the key driver for all of these policies. And thankfully,
Hmm.
ethanol right now is pricing in versus your petroleum alternative. So crude
Sure.
prices are holding. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, a lot of conflict, sadly, that drives up, the prices of crude, and that, of course, then means higher gasoline prices, right? Whereas you're having record crops globally, corn production is growing, continues to grow. So your feedstock prices are declining, and it causes divergence, right? So that's the key argument, and that's what most people listen to. Like, how much money can
Mm,
I save? The consumer inflation is still an issue, right? So you have
right.
right now like huge inflation, not huge, it's gone down, but I mean inflation is there, but they want to cut the costs of their consumers so they don't need to pay as much for their gasoline, right? Don't forget
Yeah.
a lot of the countries here have subsidized gasoline, right? So they
Mm,
have that's a cost. That's essentially a tax, right? So someone's going to pay for that. So if they
sure.
can reduce that with a product that is
It's
honestly,
more economical.
yeah, more economical, they'll go ahead with that and try
Hmm.
and implement policies. But that is the thing, right? It's getting the message out there. And I've been here
Yeah.
now 6 years, and I've been banging my drum in the region to try and get more attention focused on this great product. But there's always someone in the background blocking, right? So there's always these
Hmm.
type of vested interests in a lot of the countries that would
Definitely.
basically not encourage ethanol production. So that's kind of the biggest issue because, from an economical standpoint, from a sustainability and greenhouse gas savings, not to mention, just the air quality arguments.
Yeah.
There's so many pro arguments for ethanol. That's that's the key barrier I see is just getting policymakers and the technical people to understand the benefits and actually implemented the right policies and specifications that allow more ethanol into the markets.
Hmm. Yeah. And that's a battle that's fought everywhere ethanol is produced, right?
Exactly, exactly.
So, Well, I'm bringing it back to clean cooking because, that's our focus here at Pivot. And there's so many synergies between the transportation and the cooking markets. Because Asia has such an enormous population, many of whom are cooking with biomass, do you think that do you have a sense of whether this could expand in regions of Asia? And what do you think that might look like?
Yeah, so again, Asia is extremely diverse, right? You have very high income countries and you have
Yes.
extremely poor low income countries. So you have such a wide divergent of ways people cook. For me, I think the biggest potential in the region is South Asia. So focusing primarily on India,
Hmm.
Pakistan, Bangladesh, those regions where you have some extreme poverty, where you
Sure.
people are forced to burn whatever they can to cook a meal. So I think in those
Hmm.
regions you have huge potential. The air quality indexes for a lot of cities in the like Dhaka or New Delhi,
Yeah.
Bangalore, those areas are extremely poor air quality,
Hmm.
and I think a lot of that is coming from both ambient air pollution as well as the just burning of whatever you can to cook a meal or stay warm.
Hmm.
So I think that is a huge potential area. And I know when I fly into, for example, in New Delhi, you see signs regarding, cook stove promotions. And I think
Oh.
ethanol is a huge potential there, right? So especially with their domestic industry expanding,
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of room there. Pakistan as well as Bangladesh. I think that's where there's a huge potential.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think also, like you mentioned, they have a domestic market already, and they're really looking at meeting some of those fuel mandates. And so it really works to their favor to kind of kill two birds with one stone and improve the health outcomes and the environmental impact and the climate emissions, all, with one fuel, with one base fuel that can work for both transportation and for household energy.
Exactly.
I'm just curious, how do you cook at home?
It's gas here in
Yes,
Singapore. Most people all have a gas-fired stove here, so
sure.
that's what I cook with.
And do you see, even in your region, obviously in the rural areas, there are different options. What do people typically use there?
In Singapore, or
Well, just in your general region in Southeast Asia.
I mean, I'll be honest. I think a lot of them is in rural areas. You'd be looking at wood or just charcoal as the
Hmm.
alternative, right? If you don't have access to um, gas, LPG, of course, right? That's a
Yeah.
big one. I think in a lot of these areas.
What about electricity? How common is it to have electricity for appliances there?
I would say it's not that common generally for cooking purposes. Most people
Hmm.
cook with gas.
Okay. Interesting. So even to introduce bioethanol as a modern alternative to a gas stove, if it's cost competitive and it works just as well and it's efficient, that could also have a space in these urban areas.
Yeah, for sure. And that's an interesting question. Never thought of that. We're so used to in the Western developed countries, so used to have a constant stream of electricity. You have to understand
Hmm.
the grids in a lot of these countries don't work, right? It's just they're
Right.
underfunded. You don't have a common. You have blackouts. You don't have a regular stream of electricity, and I guess people have just developed. Of course, now that's changed as the economies have grown, but I guess it's just now people are used to cooking with gas.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, because this podcast is, relates to cooking, I do have a food related question for you. And that is, what is a must try food in Singapore for someone who's visiting?
Wow, this place has every type of food you want, right? It's such a range. Um, you've got like three Michelin star places, and then you got my favorite personally is going to the hawker centers, right? So
Okay.
the hawker centers, if you don't know, is actually UNESCO cultural heritage for Singapore.
Okay.
So it's basically you have a stall that just cooks one thing, right? So it just cooks
Okay.
what one dish, and they specialize in that dish. I personally have always been a fan of chicken rice,
Okay.
which is a Singaporean dish. It's very good. There's actually one hawker stall here, uh, which actually has a Michelin star, but you pay like maybe
Oh,
$5, $10 max for a Sing dollars for a dish. You can get dishes as low as $4, or you can go, I mean, high end. So I'd recommend definitely to try out the
okay.
hawker stalls. You got chicken rice, chili crab,
Ooh,
lots of good types of cuisine here. It's really a
awesome.
mix of everything here.
So regardless, just plan 2 weeks so you can go to a different place for every meal.
You will not that yeah that will only scratch the surface.
At least 2 weeks.
Yeah,
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time today, Johan. And, you really had a huge subject to tackle talking about the entire continent of Asia and the diversity that's there. But I really appreciate your insights and just giving our listeners a little bit of a glimpse of what the bioethanol world looks like in Asia.
thank you, Lisha. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. With over a third of the world's population lacking access to modern solutions and cooking with solid and polluting fuels like wood, charcoal, and kerosene, there are huge global impacts in multiple sectors. Pivot is passionate about opening access to household energy options around the world that also lead to reduced emissions, improved health outcomes, environmental protection, greater purchasing power, gender equity, and so much more. Join us for these personal conversations with farmers, fuel producers, distributors, stove manufacturers, policymakers, and consumers to learn about the dynamics that influence how people cook around the world. Please reach out to us at hello@pivotcleanenergy.org to find out how you can get involved. And we'd also be grateful if you found this information valuable and pass it along to friends, family, colleagues, your mailman, your grocer, anyone you know, and find some way to engage. Don't forget to follow us on our social media accounts like LinkedIn and Twitter. Check out our website at pivotcleanenergy.org. And of course, follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts so you can catch the next episode when it drops.